I didn't raise my voice when my husband said it. "We're doing separate budgets," he told me, smiling like a man who thought he was in control. "You live comfortably because of me." I nodded. I agreed. And that's what scared him later. Because if you've ever been treated like a dependent while quietly carrying the weight of everything, this story is for you. If you've ever been told your work was a hobby, your effort invisible, your value negotiable, stay with me. I didn't fight. I calculated. I didn't beg. I documented. And when his mother showed up expecting her Sunday feast, the silence broke her. If your chest feels tight right now, press like, not for me, but because you recognize this power shift. If you've lived something similar, comment. Your story deserves space. And if you want more stories where women don't explode, but outthink, subscribe. Because this isn't about money. It's about control. And how calmly taking it back changes everything. Before my marriage became a negotiation, my life ran on quiet precision. I was a freelance graphic designer, working from home, building brands for people who never questioned whether my work was real. Deadlines mattered. Details mattered. Independence mattered most of all. My grandmother had taught me that long before she passed, right before leaving me the inheritance that would later pay for most of the house I lived in. The house was my anchor. Sunlight in the mornings. Clean lines. Order. I had invested not just money, but intention into every corner. What people didn't see was how much of that order came from me. I cooked. I planned. I organized. I remembered birthdays, bills, repairs, appointments. The invisible work that keeps a life functioning without applause. To outsiders, my husband Daniel looked like the provider. He worked a stable job, spoke confidently about irresponsibility, and loved telling people how hard he worked. I let them believe it. It was easier than explaining that comfort is often subsidized by silence. What I valued most wasn't luxury, it was autonomy. Knowing I could survive without permission. That the roof over my head wasn't a favor. That my life wasn't borrowed. The imbalance didn't scream at first. It whispered. In jokes. In assumptions. In the way Daniel never asked how my day went, only whether dinner would be ready. At the time, I told myself this was normal. Manageable. Temporary. I didn't realize I was slowly being recast, from partner to dependent, until the rules of my own life began changing without my consent. And once rules change quietly, they rarely stop there. Daniel loved certainty. Or at least the illusion of it. He liked clean categories, his money, my projects, his stress, my flexibility. He spoke about his job as if it carried the entire weight of our life, even though the numbers told a different story. I stopped correcting him when his version sounded better to others. Silence became my contribution. He repeated things he'd heard growing up. A man has to lead. Someone has to be responsible. Responsibility, to Daniel, meant authority, not accountability. He never noticed how often I covered gaps. How my freelance income softened months when his expenses rose. How my grandmother's inheritance erased the risk he pretended to manage. His confidence sharpened around his parents. Especially his mother, Margaret. Around her, he straightened his posture and lowered his voice, performing the role she had written for him years ago, the provider, the head of the household. I was expected to fade into support. Smile. Serve. Stay quiet. He never said thank you. He said things like, "You're lucky you don't have to worry about real bills," as if my work didn't fund the life he enjoyed. When I mentioned long nights or demanding clients, he waved it off. At least you get to do what you like. That was the pattern. Diminish, then dismiss. I began to notice how easily he spoke over me. How quickly he corrected me in front of others. How his certainty required my silence to survive. I didn't challenge it yet. I was still measuring the weight of his words against the truth. And once I started measuring, I realized something dangerous. He believed his own story completely. which meant he'd never see the fall coming. The first real injustice came disguised as a joke. Daniel said it one evening while scrolling through his phone, not even looking at me. "Must be nice," he laughed, "to live comfortably without worrying where the money comes from." His tone was light, careless. That's what made it stick. I froze. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed something. He truly believed the comfort of our life flowed in one direction. From him. Toward me. The hours I spent designing, invoicing, chasing payments, managing clients across time zones, none of it registered as labor. It was background noise to him. Decorative. I reminded him, calmly, that I paid most of the down payment on the house. That my income wasn't pocket money. He smiled, indulgent, like I'd said something sweet but irrelevant. "That was a long time ago," he replied. "Things are different now." Different how? He didn't explain. He didn't have to. The implication was enough: my contribution had an expiration date. Later that week, Margaret criticized my cooking at Sunday lunch. Too salty. Too plain. Daniel laughed. Didn't defend me. Didn't notice how I stopped eating. That night, lying awake, I replayed the comment. Must be nice. It wasn't about money. It was about ownership. About positioning me as someone who benefited, not someone who built. That's when the temperature changed. Quietly. Internally. Because once someone convinces themselves you owe them, every kindness becomes leverage. And I knew the next step wouldn't be a joke. It would be a rule. It happened in front of his parents, which made it feel intentional. Sunday lunch was already tense, Margaret inspecting the table like a supervisor, Daniel relaxed in his chair, waiting to be served. When I brought the food out, she tasted it, paused, then sighed loudly. "You had all morning," she said. "This is what you came up with?" Daniel chuckled. Not nervous. Comfortable. "She does her best," he said, the way you'd excuse a child. Something tightened in my chest. I waited for him to correct her. To say I worked all week. That I paid for most of the groceries. That this wasn't my obligation. He didn't. He reached for his plate and added, "At least you have time for these things." Margaret smiled, satisfied. That's what I tell him. You're lucky. Lucky. The word landed heavy. It erased effort. It erased choice. It turned contribution into charity. I smiled back. Not because I agreed, but because I was watching them. Watching how easily they assumed my labor belonged to them. How naturally Daniel let his mother degrade me, as long as it reinforced his role. Later, as I cleared the table alone, Margaret called after me, "Next time, try harder." Daniel didn't look up. In that moment, I understood something clearly: this wasn't disrespect slipping through cracks. It was being served openly, with his approval. And if I stayed silent now, it would only get worse. The loss wasn't money. It wasn't even the house. It was something quieter and harder to name. I began to disappear inside my own life. Decisions were made around me, not with me. My time was assumed. My energy was scheduled. My work was treated like a placeholder until something real came along. Friends started asking why I always looked tired. I stopped inviting them over on Sundays. I didn't want witnesses to the way Margaret inspected my kitchen, or how Daniel referred to our home as his place when telling stories. Correcting him felt exhausting. Letting it slide felt worse. I noticed how careful I became with my words. How I softened everything to avoid conflict. How I justified behavior that chipped away at me, one comment at a time. Dignity erodes faster when you pretend not to notice. The worst part was the doubt. Not about them, but about myself. I caught myself wondering if I really was lucky. If maybe I owed more. If maybe peace required compliance. That's how power works. It convinces you to question what you already know. One night, I stood alone in the kitchen after everyone left, staring at the counter I'd cleaned twice that day. The house was quiet, but I wasn't at peace. Something had been taken from me, without permission and without force. My sense of ownership. My voice. My certainty. And once those are gone, everything else becomes negotiable. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the silence stopped being passive. It became deliberate. I didn't cry in front of them. That came later, alone, when the house was dark and I could finally hear my own thoughts. During the day, I functioned. I worked. I cooked. I smiled when required. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt misaligned, like I was living slightly to the left of myself. Daniel seemed pleased with my silence. He mistook it for acceptance. Margaret mistook it for obedience. That was the dangerous part. When people think they've broken you, they stop hiding who they are. They push further. They test limits you haven't defended. I started pulling inward. I stopped explaining. Stopped correcting. When Daniel dismissed my work, I didn't argue. When Margaret criticized, I nodded. Each reaction they expected, I removed. Not out of weakness, but out of necessity. I needed space to think without interference. Isolation has weight. It presses against your chest. There were nights I wondered if leaving would be easier than staying quiet. If walking away now would save me from whatever came next. But something held me still. A memory of my grandmother's voice, steady and practical, never make a permanent decision while someone else is rushing you. So I waited. I observed the rhythm of the house. The assumptions. The patterns of entitlement. I watched how Daniel spoke when he felt secure. How Margaret acted when she believed she was in control. They thought my silence meant surrender. They didn't realize it was a pause before recalculation. And recalculations, once started, don't stop until the numbers tell the truth. The decision came quietly, without drama. One morning, while Daniel talked about expenses like he was explaining something to a child, I felt a strange calm settle in. Anger would have given him what he wanted, proof that I was emotional, irrational, dependent. I wasn't going to give him that. If he wanted rules, I would follow them. Precisely. That's when he said it. We should separate budgets, he announced, confident, almost smug. It's only fair. You don't really contribute the way I do. I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I saw not power, but ignorance. He had no idea what I'd paid. What I'd covered. What I legally owned. His certainty was built on assumptions, not facts. Okay, I said. The relief on his face was immediate. He thought he'd won. Thought he'd drawn a line I wouldn't cross. He didn't ask questions. He didn't clarify terms. He didn't imagine I'd treat his rule like a contract. That afternoon, I opened a spreadsheet. I listed expenses. Contributions. Hours. Market rates for domestic labor. I pulled documents he'd never bothered to read. Deeds. Transfers. Receipts. I wasn't planning revenge. I was restoring balance. And once balance is restored, power shifts whether anyone is ready for it or not. Daniel was smiling. He had no idea it was the last time he would. For weeks after we agreed to separate budgets, Daniel floated through the house like a king surveying his kingdom. He smiled at his victory, patting himself on the back for enforcing rules he believed would diminish me. Margaret nodded in approval whenever she could, reinforcing his sense of control. I let him think he had power. I cooked only for myself. I stopped managing the household chores he relied on silently. I paid my own bills, tracked every expense, every transaction. Every dollar I spent, every hour I invested, I documented meticulously. From the outside, it looked like compliance. He believed he had trapped me in a corner, isolated me from authority. But beneath the surface, I was reorganizing. calculating the real value of my labor. Planning how to expose assumptions, lies, and entitlement. He didn't notice that I wasn't missing him, wasn't pleading, wasn't defeated. He thought the game had ended. I knew it had only just begun. I started paying attention to everything Daniel and Margaret did, every phrase they repeated, every gesture that revealed entitlement. He assumed comfort meant obedience, and she assumed authority meant compliance. Both were wrong. I tracked patterns, the way Daniel praised himself for contributions I had already made, the way Margaret expected elaborate lunches, the way they both dismissed my income and effort as secondary. Every comment, every glance, every laugh became a clue. I noticed their assumptions about my dependence, how easily they assumed I couldn't survive without him or his approval. Their blind spots were huge. Daniel never asked for receipts, never questioned where money came from, never noticed how much of the house was technically mine. Margaret never checked the pantry or the budget. She only expected me to serve. I didn't confront them. I didn't retaliate. I stayed calm. Smiled when necessary. Spoke when needed. Every moment of observation added layers to my strategy. The tension built silently. They didn't realize that knowledge, when used at the right moment, is far more powerful than yelling, pleading, or reacting. By the time they realized they were being studied, it would be too late. And I let them believe they were still in control. The first move wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront Daniel or Margaret. I simply stopped serving. No meals for them. No preparation. No invisible labor. I bought groceries only for myself, tracked every expense meticulously, and started converting household work into measurable value. Sunday arrived. Margaret waltzed in, expecting her usual spread, eyes sparkling with entitlement. I showed her the kitchen, empty counters, no food prepared. She froze. Confused. And then, on the tablet I set on the table, appeared a neatly formatted invoice, my labor, calculated at fair market rates, for every dish, every chore, every hour I had invested in the household. Daniel laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. Margaret's smile faltered as her gaze shifted between the tablet and me. The air changed. Authority she had always wielded over me became uncertain. The moment was small, controlled, but deliberate. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged. I had simply demonstrated value, and the absence of it. For the first time, they experienced the consequences of underestimating me. And in that quiet, precise action, the first cracks began to form in their sense of control. For a moment, I panicked. Margaret, furious at the empty kitchen and the invoice, threatened to call Daniel's father. She waved her phone, her voice sharp, threatening exposure of what she thought was a rebellion I shouldn't be allowed. Daniel, still smirking at first, suddenly realized the scandal was escalating beyond his control. I stayed calm. I didn't yell. I didn't apologize. I reminded myself this wasn't about being liked, it was about consequences. I recorded the interactions, documented every verbal attack, every false accusation. I ensured that even her threats could be transformed into proof of entitlement, intimidation, and disrespect. Margaret's fury could have undone the subtle power shift I had engineered. Her hysteria, if uncontrolled, could have made me appear irrational or unstable. I couldn't allow a single emotional slip to erase weeks of careful observation and preparation. Instead, I maintained poise, answering questions with calm facts, letting my documentation do the talking. Daniel's smirk began to fade. He could no longer pretend his mother's behavior reflected on me, it reflected on him. In that precarious moment, I realized timing, precision, and patience mattered more than confrontation. One wrong move, and the entire plan could unravel. And yet, the path forward was clearer than ever. To move forward, I had to give up something that felt instinctively mine, control over small comforts. I stopped cooking for myself on Daniel's schedule, no longer bought treats for anyone but me, and refused to engage in the Sunday rituals that had once masked their dominance. Each choice stung in its own way: silence at family meals, skipping social niceties, ignoring the expectation of constant presence, but I knew it was necessary. I also let Daniel think he still had control over the household finances, giving him the illusion of authority while I quietly prepared documentation, invoices, and proof of my contributions. Every dollar I spent, every task I had historically performed, became a tangible, undeniable record. It was isolating. Watching others operate under assumptions I knew to be false required patience and restraint. Every argument I avoided, every criticism I swallowed, added weight to the moment when truth would be undeniable. Sacrificing comfort, ease, and even peace of mind was deliberate. It was painful, yes, but it ensured that the eventual revelation wouldn't be challenged. And in that discipline, I could feel the subtle shift. The power was slowly leaving them, and I was quietly reclaiming it. Sunday arrived like any other, except it wasn't. Margaret expected her usual lavish lunch, eyes gleaming with anticipation, while Daniel sat back smugly, believing I had no choice but to comply. I greeted them calmly, smiled politely, and then left the kitchen empty. No food, no preparation, no explanation. Instead, I placed the tablet on the counter, displaying a professionally formatted invoice. Every dish, every chore, every hour of labor I had contributed to the household was calculated, with fair market rates applied. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face turned red as she read. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Daniel, frozen, realized that the control he assumed he had was an illusion. Every assumption he had made, that I depended on him, that the house was his domain, crumbled before his eyes. I didn't shout. I didn't beg for recognition. I simply let the facts speak. The documents, the calculations, the proof, they were undeniable. For the first time, the family saw me not as someone beneath them, but as someone who had quietly, methodically, and relentlessly calculated her power, and was no longer willing to surrender it. And in that silence, the trap snapped shut. Daniel tried to regain control, voice rising as he claimed I was exaggerating, overreacting, trying to embarrass his family. Margaret stammered, unable to regain her authority now that the invoice exposed weeks of entitlement and assumptions. Even neighbors, who had peeked in after hearing her screaming from the street, witnessed the scene, a family dynamic finally unmasked. I stayed calm, measured, precise. I repeated the facts, citing every document, every receipt, every calculation. The house that he believed symbolized his dominance was legally and financially mine. Daniel's protests became weaker as my words and proofs layered on top of each other. For the first time, the silent acknowledgement of truth formed in the room. His father, quiet until now, finally stepped forward, confirming the reality: I had contributed the most, legally and morally. Margaret could no longer manipulate perception. Daniel's assumed superiority collapsed under its own weight. The air shifted. The smug smiles vanished. Authority, once assumed by their roles, had been dismantled with evidence, patience, and calculated restraint. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't cried, I hadn't begged. The revelation was absolute, and they understood, too late, that underestimating me had been their greatest mistake. After the chaos of that Sunday, I didn't gloat. I didn't savor their discomfort. I acted with precision. I hired a divorce attorney, formalized the separation, and ensured the house, the one I had largely paid for, was legally recognized as mine. Daniel tried to argue. He tried intimidation. But every document, every invoice, every ounce of evidence I had collected left him powerless. The house was sold. He couldn't buy my share. He moved to a small apartment, stripped of the status and control he had always assumed was his birthright. Margaret, stripped of her ability to dominate, cut contact, retreating into the echoes of her own anger. Even Daniel's father, though once passive, remained distant, unwilling to participate in their schemes. I watched it all unfold calmly. Then I invested my portion from the sale into my own studio, a space entirely mine, built with skill, money, and strategy. My work flourished, my independence solidified, and for the first time in years, my life was free from manipulation, entitlement, and control masquerading as authority. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by pleading. I won through patience, calculation, and unwavering self-respect. Standing in my studio, sunlight spilling over clean counters and organized desks, I finally understood, they were right about one thing. I didn't inherit comfort from them. I inherited my life. And nothing, no entitlement, no arrogance, no screams, could take it away from me again. If this story of quiet strength and calculated justice moved you, hit like to show that patience and strategy can triumph over arrogance. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated or forced to prove your worth? And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of clever, fearless women taking control of their lives.